Yes, he's giving a talk on the meaning of spiritual community, and it's very interesting that he chooses then to say, well, what is a spiritual community? And he says a spiritual community is a community that supports us to develop positive states of mind or skillful states of mind. And that means we have to work on unskillful states of mind. And then he defines his terms. That's roughly what he's doing. And he says very simply that unskillful states of mind are those which are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. This is all very familiar material. And he says we can say this in a very generalized way, but then he quotes this Tibetan quote where he says this gives us much more detail. So I'm just going to read that out. And it's exactly what you have on the printed sheet. So it says, the Buddhist usage of the term skillful also suggests that being unskillful, we get ourselves into difficulties, even incur inconvenience, not to say suffering. Just as if we handle a knife or chisel clumsily, then sooner or later we are bound to cut ourselves. The three English words, craving, aversion, and delusion, do render quite faithfully and accurately, indeed almost literally, the three corresponding terms in the original languages of Sanskrit and Pali. But perhaps they do not give us much real insight into the meaning of those terms. A Tibetan source, however, gives us a more extended and detailed account. According to this source, craving is longing desire to possess objects of sensuous cognition, which you like, and to include them in your ego identity, in the hope of getting a sense of security from having them as part of you. Aversion is defined as fearful and angered repulsion, to get rid of objects of sensuous cognition which you dislike, and to exclude them from your ego identity, in the hope of getting a sense of security from not having them as part of you. And as you can see, these definitions, as you can see from these definitions, one is the opposite of the other. Finally, delusion, which is defined as a stubborn, closed-mindedness about learning anything which you might feel, which might threaten your ego identity and upset the sense of security you wish to get from it, but which you are unaware of and therefore feel you must protect. And then he says, even though comparatively short, these three definitions are quite profound and far-reaching. So it says, with the help of these three definitions, we can begin to see what is meant by spiritual community. By spiritual community, we mean a community which encourages the development in its members of skillful rather than unskillful mental states as being the best ideal for human beings. In the same way, the spiritual life is a life devoted to the elimination of unskillful and to the development of skillful mental states. In a higher sense, it is a life which is based entirely upon and expressive of the skillful mental states of contentment or peace of mind, friendliness and wisdom. Spiritual practice, it follows, is therefore any observance, any method or exercise which is conducive to the eradication of unskillful and to the development of skillful mental states. So he tells us this in 1975. And it's interesting, he chooses to highlight all of that in a lecture about spiritual community. I think he had quite a strong vision for how community acts as a guru, in a way, really acts as a way of, individuals from that community will help us work individually on our mental states. He doesn't ask us to have a strong teacher necessarily or relate to one person. He's asking us to use a system of collective practice, a system of community to reflect back to who you are. So then about 20 years later, he met with the executive or the trustees, I think, or council members of Windhorse Trading, which was the big tea-based right livelihood situation at the time. And they wanted to talk to him. They had 2 days with Bhante to discuss all the questions they had about that particular business. And they went into some of the practical things, but they also went into that situation as a context for spiritual practice. And they had one burning question. Was it possible to gain insights within a collective practice based around warehouse, van driving, and selling gifts, basically? And was it that you could do that for the first 10 or 15 years of your spiritual life, and then you went to somewhere proper for the development of insight? And that would be a meditation center, something like that, something rural, out in the country, where you reflected on your experience. And they asked the question over and over again throughout the seminar. And I'm just going to, again, read you extracts from that. Just finding one of them. I think it's this question of, some of us have been working at Windhorse for 8 years already and could be here for another 10 or more years. It could even be a whole lifetime of work at Windhorse Trading. Then this question arises: is this lifestyle conducive to developing insight? Okay, we've talked a bit about mindfulness already, and I think certainly there are types of mindfulness that we can develop more easily in terms of working together. But in terms of actually developing insight, I think the question has come up that maybe work is something that you do for a while to get your energy going, something like this. But then it is necessary to have a more refined approach, as represented by some sort of retreat-like situation, in order to have the conditions for developing insight. That is the topic that we've discussed in our chapter meetings. And then Bhante answers, well, one could ask what one means by insight, but I take it we don't need to go into that. We have at least a rough idea of what we mean by insight. I would say that one of the characteristics of insight is, by its very nature, not dependent on any particular set of conditions. It could be that for certain people at certain times, certain conditions are more conducive to the development of enlightenment. But in principle, by its very nature, insight does not depend on any particular set of conditions, because insight arises within situations of non-insight, or its arising depends on situations or conditions that are not those of insight. So really what he then goes on to describe is more crucial situations that just arise in life: bereavement, work situations that are very difficult, separation in a relationship, things that would trigger a very strong response in us, and then is asking us to look at that response and see what's actually really going on there. So here he goes. It does seem that insight is more likely to arise if the situation is an extreme situation. Well, if, say, you're in a meditation situation, the situation can take an extreme form just due to the stress of personal problems or philosophical difficulties, or because you're being urged by a very demanding master. But without those things, I think you don't get it, even in the meditative situation. If there is no great pressing philosophical problem that you are desperate to solve, or an acute personal problem that you have just got to get over, or a master who is standing over you with a stick, if you don't have any of those things, I think the meditative situation is not very likely, just by itself, to provide the basis for insight. other situations outside meditation, if they do push you to the edge, they can be situations in which insight can arise. And then he goes on to describe those kind of situations. And somebody asks him, it sounds a bit as if we need to stay practicing when we are in these extreme situations. But what I tend to find is that something goes wrong, I'll get angry, and that takes me off the horns of the spiritual dilemma. And then Sangharakshita says, well, on the other hand, you mustn't think in terms of superimposing the practice on what you're actually doing. What you're actually doing is the practice. Even if you get angry, it's not enough just to say, oh, I mustn't get angry. That is just, as it were, on the samatha level. You are thinking in terms of trying to develop insight. Well, what is this anger? Who is getting angry? Just even stay with the experience of anger without expressing it and look into it. Who is getting angry? Who is this I who is so upset? But not try to, as it were, smother the anger or just to calm it down as if it was a hindrance to samatha, which you can do, but we are talking about the possibility of developing insight. You may say, in fact, about the possibility of developing insight, you may say paradoxically, if you're thinking in terms of developing insight, it may be more helpful to stay with the anger than to calm it down. Although you mustn't give outward expression to it. So this weekend's been building up to a sense of how we can do this kind of work. How can you look at your experience? How can you look at your reactions and do a kind of level of introvertism that takes you to a slightly deeper level than just understanding that you're getting angry? I mean, this morning we were looking at stories that we're telling ourselves. And it's really good. That's good information. Often when we're getting very angry or very upset, underneath that is a whole layer of stories going on. Stories about who we are, stories about who we think we should be, stories about other people. Stories about other people is usually an indication of the story about ourselves, only it's disguised. Yeah. And it's not enough just to exchange a negative story with a more positive story, although that can be useful and can be constructive. You're trying to see why you have a need for a story at all. What is going on underneath that? And that's where we come to these root poisons. That's when we come to a way that we grip onto an ego identity in the hope of getting a sense of security from it. So all the time, all the stories and the reactions are about us clinging to some sense of security. And that's what's underneath, that's the sort of bedrock underneath everything. So where are we going to be looking for this? So it's all very familiar material. It's very, in many respects, you'll find it in the mindfulness work that you're doing. Mindfulness is going to lead us there in that direction. You become aware that there are physical sensations and you become aware of a certain kind of obsessiveness in your thoughts. And all of this indicates that you're having a reaction, that something in your experience has been threatened by something else. And this is where you need to look. Saddaloka uses this beautiful metaphor of the glaciers breaking the surface, like a big whale or a big, like a beautiful dolphin in a way, a sort of wild creature breaking the surface of the sea. And that glacier, those wild animals, they're all in us all the time. And every now and then, there's a bit of contact we have, maybe with a thought, or maybe with another person, or maybe with just the environment that triggers a response in us, which brings a glacier up above the surface. Okay, breaks the surface. So we're looking at that wild creature in us that's breaking the surface. And then we're trying to go drill right down through that. So we're catching those sensations that gives us a sense of reactivity. And when there's a reactivity in us, we know that some sense of ourself has been, some sense of security in ourself has been triggered. And that gives us an idea that we are all the time holding on to some form of security. And it's very raw data down there in that, on that level. It can just be simply a sense of a deep need for control. That comes out very strongly, I think, particularly at the moment when we're in a situation where there's a lot of, there's a more acute awareness of the possibility of death for a lot of us. Some people live with that more strongly, but at the moment, some of us are having to acclimatize to that. And that shakes us on that level, that existential level, where we have that kind of dis-ease, as Saddhanandi was talking about this morning. We're existentially anxious at that level. And at that point, we just want control. We want to really know who we are. We want to grip very tightly. And we can grip through these three different ways of the craving grip, the aversion, or the delusion. And this is very hard to do, but when you realize that there's something gripping right down there on that level, you're trying to then see, what am I actually gripping onto? Who is there at that level? What is there? You know, if I was to remove bits of Saddhanandi, you know, remove this bit, take out that, where is the hardware? Where is the box that says this is who I am and this is what I should be identifying with and this is what's under threat? There's nothing there. There's nothing there. So you're trying to reach that level of how we're constructing ourselves around something that doesn't exist. Of course, something does exist in the sense that I am actually having this conversation with you. So something does exist, but not what we think it does. So we're gripping onto something that doesn't exist from that point of view.